As we would expect with any great story, the first chapter of 1 Samuel paints a picture of what is to come in the books that we call 1 and 2 Samuel. And in this video, I want to draw your attention to 3 items as we read the very first chapter. The first point is that the author is going out of his way to highlight the noble heritage of Samuel. Did you notice that the first person that we're introduced to in this story is Elkanah, and he is identified as the descendant of several respectable men. In the ancient world, people didn't have last names, and the vast majority of them are born, they live an average of 30 or 40 years, they never travel more than a few miles away from their home, and they die without anyone ever really remembering that they even lived. Those are the harsh realities of the ancient world. And here is another one, being barren. Throughout history, humankind lived to do one thing, and that was to reproduce. And humans did almost anything to guarantee or to safeguard that, including adopting polygamy, which is the practice of having more than one spouse or mate. Now, typically when it comes to the Hebrew Bible, this was specifically the practice of a man having more than one wife. And although it completely goes against modern sensibilities, women agreed to marry a man who was already married for a variety of reasons. For instance, she could have been without a job or other resources, and this was her only way to have provisions. Or, regrettably, she could have been forced into that marriage against her will. Or, another example is that she could have eagerly entered into the marriage because she knew that it provided her opportunities and granted her privilege, because the man that she was marrying was obviously a man of wealth and power if he could afford to have more than one spouse. Whatever the case, in a very patriarchal culture in which men effectively made all the decisions, they ruled and they passed the laws, a woman in general would rather be married to a man with multiple wives and have provision and the chance to have a child than to be single or married and not have a child at all. I know that this sounds strange and it goes against the grain of our modern culture, but this was the reality in biblical times. Barrenness was the most dreaded thing that could happen to a woman, and she would in general do all that she could in order to guarantee the ability to be able to have a child. The second point that I want to make is that the Israelites were supposed to make an annual pilgrimage to Shiloh for worship, which was the center of Israelite worship before it became Jerusalem, and that was after David became king. We have to remember that there were no churches, there were no synagogues, there was no real religious democracy. So the only way that it was permissible for a person to worship the Lord was to go to Shiloh. Now, of course, people could still pray and they could study wherever they wanted, but they could only worship, which effectively meant that they had to make animal or grain sacrifices to the Lord at one prescribed location, which is Shiloh. And at this tabernacle in Shiloh, Hannah prayed fervently to God without the aid of priests or sacrifices or rituals, which was quite unusual as these were the means by which people interacted with God. The priest, whose name was Eli, and that's Hebrew for my God, assumed that Hannah was drunk, which indicates his inability to lead effectively. The author is giving us foreshadowing. He's letting us know that the priest in charge, that is the one who mediates between God and the people, is no longer fit for service because he can't even distinguish true prayer from false prayer. The author is also setting us up for a very common theme in the Bible, and that's that God loves listening to people who are humble, who are not part of mainstream power, and who are desperate. As Hannah's prayer in the next chapter is going to reveal, God has a habit of turning the tables on power, just like Jesus was going to do 1,000 years later when he is in Jerusalem at the temple. Yahweh, which is the special name of God for the Israelites, really likes it when those who are downtrodden and don't have equal access to power and resources pour out their hearts in faith. And that's exactly what Hannah does, which is extraordinary. By being willing to dedicate her son to the Lord's work, The faith of Hannah is revealed as if it had been refined in a fire. Although we initially might think that what she wanted above everything else was a child, what she really wanted above everything else is a dynamic relationship with God the Father. As we can see in this story, Hannah's relationship with God comes first. Finally, the third and the last point that I want to draw your attention to in this opening chapter is that the narrative is preparing us for the holy calling that Samuel is going to have. His name, not coincidentally, means asked of God, or Shamuel in Hebrew, and it's predicated on Hannah's own faith. Just as Hannah vowed, Samuel is going to become a Nazirite for life, which means that he has to do away with three things. He can never cut his hair, he can never drink wine or vinegar, and he can never touch a corpse. After being weaned by his mother Hannah, a few years later, and in that culture a child was usually weaned around the age of 4 or 5, Samuel is going to be brought to Shiloh to serve God in fulfillment of her vow for life. And amazingly, Hannah gave her son to God just as she said she would. The baby that she had nursed night after night, the baby that she had played with and that she had protected with her own life. This is the baby that she gives to the Lord. And in this way, she made the greatest sacrifice that any person could ever make. And this sets her up for being, in my opinion, one of the most important figures in the entire Bible. What she does is literally divine. She embodies the very essence of God by giving up her only begotten Son, just like God the Father gives up His only begotten Son. And what she gets in return is more than she could ever bargain for.